Is the constitutional order of America dead? If so, what killed it, and where do we go from here? On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by Nate Hochman to discover these very questions. Welcome, everyone, to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well everywhere I go. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, I am joined by Nate. And Nate, did I pronounce your last name correctly? Is it Hochman? Hochman? Help me out here.
Yeah, you nailed it. Everyone gets it wrong, so you're in the small minority of people who got it right.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Nate Hochman. Go ahead and tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I'm Nate. I'm a writer for the American Spectator. I write for a bunch of other conservative journals and magazines as well, but that's sort of my home base columnist paper. And I'm a senior advisor at America 2100, which is a new sort of new right, new conservatism, nationalist think tank and advocacy group that we're trying to get off the ground here in DC in time for 2024. So that's how I spend most of my time these days when I'm not tweeting.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you on. Really excited for this conversation. Before we get started, for you listeners, feel free to go on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can go ahead and put in your email there to receive all of our episodes straight to your email. Occasionally, I do some extra writing that shows up there as well. And if you want, you can even do a paid tier for some additional content and to help support the show. We really appreciate it. Feel free to check out all of our catalog. We really appreciate all your feedback on that. And we are currently live on YouTube, Rumble, and X. So feel free to repost the stream. If you are on my profile is at Forge and A. Feel free to follow us there for additional content and updates on the show. That being said, let's get straight into it. I do still have a slight tickle in my throat, so I'll try not to cough too much. I'll mute myself when I need to hack up a storm. But yeah, Nate, I had reached out to you because you wrote a fantastic article following the controversy that was kind of launched by Nate Fisher, who's also been on the show in the past. He essentially talked about how the Constitution is dead, and those who pretend that it is not dead are sort of living in a fairy tale land. So that said, your article, America is Not a Parchment Promise, kind of goes through that story, detailing everything that happened with Nate, some of the critics, and everything else. So why don't we go ahead and start by just asking why you wrote the article in the first place, and why you jumped into this controversy?
Yeah, well, we were talking briefly before we kicked off the stream about how this seems to be like a reoccurring debate or discourse in conservative circles. It seems like someone says something to the effect of what Nate said every 6 months or so, and there's this brief sort of hysterical reaction from people denouncing it or agreeing with it, vigorously, and it sort of starts a debate, and it lasts for 2 weeks, and then everyone forgets about it until it comes up, 6 months later. My point, other than to basically point out that I think that the merits of what Nate was saying were obviously and undeniably true, the point about America not being a parchment promise, that was the title of the piece, was also to add like a sort of corrective where we could root a kind of modern American patriotism in something other than the Constitution. Because if the Constitution, at least the founders' Constitution, is dead, and again, I think that it's been dead for more than a century, at least since the New Deal, if not before that. We live under a completely different system in every measurable way from the one the founders designed. I mean, I don't even think that anyone could actually disagree with that on the merits. But we are still patriots. If we are on the right, and I am a patriot, then you have to look somewhere else for your sense of what is it that makes America great, and what is it that we are trying to conserve or revitalize or renew or restore. And while I think conservatives should be working to a restoration of aspects of the Constitution, a lot of that is beyond reach, and therefore we need something deeper and more innate about the American character other than that. And I think there's plenty of stuff to reach for. That's what I was going into in the piece. But the fundamental point is that, if the Constitution is dead, and it is, at least as like an actual structure of government, what do you do now if you're on the right? Because you can sort of wax poetic about James Madison and George Washington, and they were great men who were wise and brilliant and still have a lot of insights and things to teach us. But it's not a matter of passing a law to abolish a particular government agency. Like, we're past that point. We've been past that point for a century. So you have to think in, creative different terms. And I think that's the sort of conversation that conservatives are having, and they need to continue to have.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think something that you detail in your piece as well is that a lot of the critics that kind of came up after Nate brought this up, they were saying things like, "Oh, and there it is, everybody! Oh, they're finally revealing themselves," and they're attacking these people on the right that are making this observation as if it's such a gotcha moment, like we finally mask off, revealed ourselves. And to me, it's just such a, it seems like such a misunderstanding that I hope is just innocent of the argument being presented. Because the reality is so many of these critics have been acting as though Nate Fisher or people who happen to agree with the idea that the Constitution, at least as it was written in the founding, is dead. They are acting like we rejoice in that. And the reality is, to your point already, like there's so many amazing things in the Constitution that we wish we could go back to. We wish that the Constitution of the founding era was actually what governed us. But that's just not the reality that we live under. So it's not that we are happy the Constitution is dead. It's we are trying to live in reality here and understand the political landscape in light of the fact that the founding era Constitution is no longer what governs us. You actually mentioned, in fact, I have it right here. You mentioned Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, which is a fantastic book that I highly recommend my viewers listen. I've referenced it a few times on this show before, but Caldwell essentially outlines the fact that the Constitution was replaced by the Civil Rights Acts in the 60s. And essentially, whether you like it or not, so much of what happened legislatively in the 60s under the guise of civil rights, whether the intentions were pure or not, ultimately it ended up replacing the Constitution. And so we see these rival factions kind of born in the 60s. And we see so many things like, just being realistic, some of the things that has happened over the past several decades is 100% unconstitutional by the founding Constitution standards. But they are able to take place because of everything that took place in the 60s and the counter-revolution that took place, with a lot of it coming in through civil rights legislation. Anything to add on that front with Caldwell and his observations?
No, you're absolutely right. And, people talk about America having had a series of refoundings, which I think is a little bit overly simplistic, but is essentially correct, which is that America as a political regime, in sort of technical sense of the word, as a political system, the system of government that we live under, that politics happens in, there were refoundings before the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Revolution. The Civil War and Lincoln's reforms were a radical transformation of the constitutional system as it had existed up until that point. The application of the Bill of Rights to states, for example, radically transformed the system. We had state churches in most states before incorporation, and also the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, adding equality to the Bill of Rights as an actual political imperative. That was a radical transformation that led to more radical transformations after that. So that was a refounding. The New Deal was a massive radical transformation of the relationship between the state and civil society and the individual that most people, I think, would argue was a refounding. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act and the subsequent Civil Rights Act expansions were another refounding. And I think we're in the sort of throes of another battle right now, another struggle over another fundamental attempt to reconstitute the United States post kind of BLM revolution, the DEI revolution, all the things we're struggling with right now, which a lot of people, including Caldwell, would argue are the sort of culmination of the logic of the civil rights regime, which I think is broadly true, but is also a radical transformation in and of itself. So it's not that we had the Founders Constitution up until the 1960s and then it was replaced. Like there were a series of sort of substitutions. The point I was making in the piece is that there are it's not like America became a new country like that every time these things happened. You had these much more fundamental characteristics that ran throughout, that to an extent, at least in pockets of America, still exist today. and are the sort of main thing that we should be seeking to try to revitalize and renew as conservatives. But as a political system, as a systematic analysis, you had multiple transformations of the political system that just got further and further away from the founders' constitution over the course of the next 2-3 centuries.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. And your observation's great. That was a great 30,000 foot look at kind of all the different transformational periods that the Constitution underwent. And you observe in this piece that that it's not like the founding era has no sway on our daily lives. In fact, I'll go ahead and just read an excerpt from your piece here, and I'll try not to butcher it. What does still have bearing on American life, albeit in a severely diminished form, is the remnants of the way of life and set of political traditions that the founders attempted to secure, what is, in actuality, their most magnificent and enduring accomplishment. The political folkways of the American nation, inherited from its Anglo-Saxon origins and shaped in unique and distinctive ways by the experience of the New World, both proceeded from the Constitutional Convention. This, rather than any abstract set of principles, is the story of both the American founding and the documents to which it gave birth. Rather than initiating some revolutionary transformation, the Declaration of Independence merely confirmed an existing state of affairs, wrote Mel Bradford. Rather than enshrining a set of radical ideals, the Constitution built a structure of common government upon a common legal inheritance, common origins, and an established unity of purpose. The purpose of the American Revolution was to conserve rather than to overturn. No new contract is drawn, Bradford wrote of the Declaration. Rather, one that exists is preserved by amputation. So, obviously, there's a whole lot there in that brief bit that I just read aloud. But I mean, essentially, what you're getting at here, and feel free to correct me if I'm reading you incorrectly. But essentially, we had a way of life that was passed down to us by our ancestors in the free, especially Christianized West. I'm not sure your faith makeup, Nate, but I know here on the show we have explored a lot of the rise of Christendom and how it really brought about so much of the human rights freedoms that we see that America ultimately, you could argue, was the pinnacle of. But this started many hundreds of years back in the sort of Western history that was heavily influenced by Christianity and its overtaking of Rome and all the progression that takes place in Europe from there. But ultimately, it's that rich history that we are drawing influence from. And really, when we actually set up the founding documents of the country, all we were doing was putting in paper what we were already well aware of. If I'm living in the founding era, I should say, of what governs us, what kind of common ideas of justice and God-given rights. All we're doing is putting pen to paper about what we already observe and believe. Would you say that would be a fair takeaway?
No, that's absolutely right. And this is something that conservatives used to understand. The sort of neoconservative revolution in the 70s and 80s rewrote conservatism and therefore subsequently also rewrote our understanding of American identity, American history, all of these different things. Neoconservatism, which was not the original conservatism of the 1950s and the early National Review masthead, right, was liberal. I mean, this is not a pejorative slur. This is the way that people like Irving Kristol and John Podhoretz described themselves. John Podhoretz described himself as a neoliberal. And therefore, their conception of American history, American identity, the roots of Americanism, and the American founding was liberal, which is, there's a sort of dominant, now it's less fashionable on the left because the left has become much more overtly sort of anti-American. But for most of the 20th century, there's a kind of liberal patriotism. It was misplaced, but it was a conception of American history and the American founding as a liberal project about universal human rights and, free speech and all of these sort of liberal Lockean concepts. And the conservative position back then, which I think is still the correct one, even though it's not one that a lot of conservatives hold today, was that was not the story of the founding or of the founders or of American history. and that in a very fundamental sense, the founding did not create a new nation. It in a formal political sense, it established an independent country. But America was a nation before the founding, and the founding and the Declaration of Independence and the separation from Great Britain were sort of a realization in formal terms of a nation that already very much existed, and it existed for a century or more. That was British in its, in its ethnicity, in its roots, in its culture, in its religion, in its sort of, way of looking about the world, but was distinct from Britain. And that the Americans had sort of, over the maturation, over the process of centuries, had come to develop an independent national consciousness, and that the revolution was a sort of culmination of that. It was them finally realizing their independence in a full sense of the word. But if you read, there's obviously diversity of thought amongst the founders, and you can find bits and pieces from different founders to confirm whatever worldview you want to argue for.
Right.
So you got people like Thomas Jefferson, who were much more liberal than Adams or Madison or Hamilton. But if you read the Federalist Papers, not just the sort of oft-quoted little bits and pieces of the Federalist Papers that people take out of context now, but the full Federalist Papers, if you read the letters between the founders, if you read what they were saying to one another, what they're writing in the papers, and also what other people, what the sort of mood was on the ground at the time, what the papers were writing in places like Boston and New York, there's a very viable argument that I think is basically true, that the American Revolution was a conservative revolution. It was an attempt to conserve a way of life that already existed in America, that Britain and British Parliament specifically was threatening by basically putting the squeeze on them with taxes and taxation without representation. All these things we're sort of familiar with, and that Americans, as a self-conscious, independent country, had sort of become fed up with or exasperated with this country that wasn't theirs, telling them how to run their country. And it was an attempt to take back a way of life that was threatened by a foreign country from abroad. That, I think, is a much more accurate, sort of rich picture of what the founding and the revolution were about than a sort of radical break with everything that had existed before that created a completely new country out of thin air that hadn't existed before. You obviously had new things about the Constitution, but if you read, I forget if it was Madison or Hamilton or someone else, there's a famous quote about the Bill of Rights that said, basically, the rights we put in the Bill of Rights were only the ones that were most obvious and widely accepted to every American citizen. The Bill of Rights was a codification of things that already existed, right? The reason they had a Second Amendment was because everyone owned guns already. And it was widely understood that a critical part of citizenship was being able to defend yourself owning guns. Same thing with speech, et cetera, et cetera. So it was not an attempt to create something radically new with a radically new set of principles. It was an attempt to basically take a way of life that had already existed and write it down formally on paper so that it was actually an official political system.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you can see that with some of the arguments between the founders, and the earliest presidents of the Union, talking all about how, there's the debate between whether or not we're going to set ourselves up to be a industrial empire or whether or not we're going to set ourselves up to be an agrarian society. And to me, that kind of gives weight to what you're saying here. Why would there be an entire argument for let's remain an agrarian society if that wasn't such a huge cultural aspect of the original colonies in the first place? So I think that's well said. Now I want to talk about if the Constitution's dead, why is it dead? What killed it? And I should say, how is it dead? We already talked a little bit about the what, but how is it dead? Because someone's gonna come on here and say we have these wins in the courts, showing that the Constitution is still being upheld. Roe v. Wade was overturned. We see the Supreme Court struck down some different Second Amendment violations. So I know you've given a couple of examples in your piece, but maybe flesh that out a little bit for us, how exactly the Constitution is dead.
Yeah, well, just briefly as an aside, what conservatives talk about in terms of wins in the courts, in terms of sort of restoring a constitutional jurisprudence, in the Supreme Court, the Constitution they're talking about, in some ways, it's closer to what the founders would have envisioned. But even the concept of winning a Supreme Court case to apply a particular law nationwide was radically distinct from the actual the founder system. The federal government was tiny. Almost all governance that mattered happened at the state level. And, federalism really existed in a way there that it doesn't exist anymore. Like I was talking about earlier, you had state churches, right? You had anti-blasphemy laws, all these different institutions that would be considered, even by conservatives now, wildly unconstitutional. And the sort of the national constitution was a very broad, very sparse framework, securing some sort of basic, like the Bill of Rights was Congress shall make no law, right? Congress shall make no law doing this, doing X, doing Y. It was not supposed to apply to every law that existed in America. States were very welcome to do all kinds of laws. It was supposed to limit the national government's ability to impose on states that were doing their own thing. So even winning, a constitutional case for originalism in the court is adhering to a very different constitution than the ones the founders were talking about and instituted. And that dates back, like we said, to like Lincoln and the Reconstruction Amendments, which applied the Bill of Rights to states in ways that essentially transformed the sort of federalist system that had existed up until that point. But even more basically, all of our understanding of the Bill of Rights themselves, like our actual interpretation of the words, are radically different than the founders would have interpreted them to be. And something like an administrative state, this massive bureaucracy of thousands and thousands of bureaucrats at the federal level, did not exist up until, the New Deal and really, then the Great Society and the sort of subsequent amendments and reformations. Like the administrative state is where most laws get made today. Most of the laws that affect Americans today are not crafted by people they vote for. They're crafted by unelected bureaucrats who often are there through Republican and Democrat administrations, and that you can't vote out of office. Like that is not something that has any relationship to the story we like to tell about sort of constitutional government in America, because it wasn't supposed to exist. So dealing with that it's just a completely different technocratic system post-managerial revolution, and a completely different sort of ruling class than the ones that existed in America in that case, really up until the New Deal and really sort of after that. So, you have, like I was talking about in the piece, remnants of the political traditions that existed in the founding era and have sort of persisted through all of these different refoundings. Like the way we do law, our legal system, that is an inheritance from, something that predates the founding. It's a sort of Anglo-Saxon tradition that goes back, a millennia in some cases. Right. A certain amount of sort of checks and balances. You still have a Supreme Court, you still have a Congress, a presidency. We do have a First Amendment that gives us much more free speech than most other Western countries. And the censorship happening in Western countries, including ones that are very close to us, is like still inconceivable to Americans. It's getting insane in Europe in terms of censorship. So you have these like institutional aspects to our legal culture, our political culture, that are very much like written into the American character. But the actual system, the way the political system works, what it's oriented towards, has almost no resemblance to the one that the founders instituted.
Yeah. Yeah. And you give a good example. You bring up Jack Phillips, the baker, as kind of an example, just one anecdotal story of how exactly you can see that the Constitution, at least as the founders intended, is dead, and it is not what governs us. His story is very high profile. A lot of people know him, but maybe just give us a brief retelling of Jack Phillips and why you think he's a good example to show that the constitutional order that the founders set up is now dead.
Right. So Jack Phillips is a Christian baker. He owned a small sort of bakery in a mid-sized town in Colorado. And in 2014, the case was 2015, so it might have been 2013 when it first happened. A gay couple, two gay men, walked into his bakery and were like, "We want you to custom bake a cake endorsing gay marriage for our gay wedding." And he said very politely, "You guys are welcome to have any pre-made cake off the shelf, but I'm a Christian. I don't believe in that. I can't custom bake a cake endorsing same-sex marriage." So they took him to court. The Civil Rights Commission of Colorado ruled against him, said he had to make the cake. He had to appeal it over and over again, eventually got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in 2015 in Masterpiece Cake Shop let him off on like a technicality. It was like kind of a cop-out ruling where they said he doesn't have to bake the cake, but for these like very technical reasons that like people in the Civil Rights Commission made some anti-Christian remarks, and therefore, that is why, they let him off, rather than like he has innate religious liberty. He doesn't have to bake the cake. And the day that he won his case in the Supreme Court, the sort of background noise to all of this is he had been subjected to, bullying in the national media. This is like a small business owner, like in random, Colorado, bullying in the national media, sustained harassment from all of these big, huge, powerful, gajillion-dollar lefty activist groups like the ACLU, vandalism in his cake shop. He lost 40% of his business. Like the guy's life has been torn to shreds. And the day that he finally, after years in court fighting, got off in the Supreme Court, this transgender activist called the bakery and told him to make me a sex change surgery cake with a dildo on it and a picture of like Satan, engaging in intercourse, like just like the most obscene, most blasphemous possible, that this transgender activist could cook up. Obviously, the activist didn't actually expect him to make the cake. The activist just wanted to be able to drag him back into court again. So the same day he finally gets off after years of fighting, he's back in court. He's still in court. So he's been in court for a decade. He's lost 40% of his business. They've ruined his life, et cetera, et cetera. The process is the punishment. And the point I was making there was conservatives, gleefully gloat over these Supreme Court cases as huge wins for religious liberty. And it's like, it doesn't actually matter. I mean, yes, it's better that the Supreme Court ruled for him than against him, but the left can effectively ruin religious liberty if they can just make it impossible for you to exercise it, right? Like if you have to spend a decade in court or the rest of your life in court fighting for your basic religious liberty rights, and you lose your business in the process, like you don't really have religious liberty. So conservatives focus on the end of the process and say, well, he got his religious liberty, so the Constitution is doing great. But that is not what the Constitution was intended to do, right? It wasn't intended to be something that you spend a decade, financed by different groups, finally getting your religious liberty at the end of the tunnel, sort of. It was supposed to mean that people had free exercise of their religion, that they could actually follow their conscience. So conservatives, we've spent, decades building this conservative legal movement, and we're so focused on the courts, we've kind of missed the forest for the trees, which is that there's a lot of other ways that the left, the regime, whatever you want to call it, can dismantle these things without ever actually having to beat us in court.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at the end of the day, no one should have to lose 40% of their business and spend over a decade in court just to have the freedom to reject something that goes against their religious beliefs. If you truly believe that the founding documents that the founding fathers set up are what govern us. I mean, that's just, you can't make that argument, I believe, in good faith without ignoring a lot of the facts on the ground. You paint a picture as well in the article about kind of the situation that we find ourselves in, and I think it kind of ties in well with the sort of a bookend that we just put on Jack's story. You wrote, the elites, not just in the halls of government, but in corporate boardrooms, the cultural industry, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and academia, on down to the public education system, are not just un-American, but anti-American, and militantly so. Their project is one of de-Americanization, not entirely dissimilar from the de-kulakization program launched by the Soviet regime. The very explicit and overt goal is to wipe away anything recognizably American at all and to replace what was once America with a completely new country and completely new people. So obviously that's a very dark description of what's going on, but in my mind, I wouldn't say it's inaccurate in the slightest. So we have to recognize that we are essentially living in a country that is completely ideologically captured by people that are anti-American. And I think most people are starting to wake up to this idea. It's just a matter of most people are just starting to realize, hey, we have to do something about this. And doing everything the same old is not going to cut it. Michaela in the chat earlier said, it seems scary to rewrite it, though, referring to the Constitution, due to the lack of common Christian morality. If not rewriting, then what? And I'd like to spend a moment on that question. Adams said our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other, to read the full quote out. And I think that's ultimately what we are now finding ourselves arguing now on the conservative right in online spaces is where do we go from here? That's where you see the whole Christian nationalism debate come into the fray. That's where you see people talking about how we need an American Caesar. Essentially, we need a dictator for righteous purposes to sort of be a King Josiah to tear down the high places and cut down the Asherah poles. So that we maybe will see a generation of deliverance, or hopefully our nation will be spared entirely. But of course, that's where the debate starts to get heated as to what we are ultimately going to do. So, Nate, obviously, we don't have time to come up with a solution to centuries old problems tonight. But what's your kind of take on directionally where we go from here once we are able to recognize that the constitutional order that maybe we are taught in civics class is officially dead?
Yeah, well, they don't even teach you it in civics class anymore. They teach you,
Fair.
Aztec incantations or something like that instead. So the reason I was sort of getting into the Phillips case, and then I followed up with the point you're making, is like a contrast where conservatives, to Michaela's point about rewriting, the important thing to understand is that the Constitution's already been rewritten, right? To your point earlier, would that it weren't so. Would that we still lived under the founders' form of government, which I think was the most brilliant form of government ever conceived, but could only exist under certain conditions that no longer exist. And are long gone, just in a fundamental sense. The contrast between Phillips and the point about what sort of the elites are doing to our country is the point I was trying to illustrate was conservatives for decades have thought about politics like procedurally, right? So the way you win is you win an election, you pass a law, maybe, you get your judges on the court, you win court cases, and that's how you win politics, right? Meanwhile, as we've been doing that to varying levels of success, we've lost our country. In Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, the march has just been leftwards the entire time. There's never been a check. Government's gotten bigger. Obviously, that's part of it. The culture has moved radically to the left. Our borders are being opened. Literally, the American people are being replaced in their country. Like, there is no way in which the country isn't being completely transformed from bottom up and from top down. And conservatives have to think about politics in a much more fundamental sense than winning elections, maybe passing some sort of piecemeal reforms on the edges, getting your judges on the bench, because clearly that's not enough. When the left controls academia, the technology sector, big business, the bureaucratic state, the administrative state, the media, the education system, academia, the expert class, like there is no institution, no power center in American life that they don't control. Just maybe getting control of government every couple years by a slim majority is not going to bring you home. It's not going to get us home. So you have to think about politics we are in a fundamental civilizational crisis right now, full stop. That is, the cancer is attacking the most basic building blocks of what it is to be a civilization. Not even just Americanism anymore. I mean, like what it is to be a man or a woman, right? Like they're dismantling the basic aspects of any sort of public moral order at all. And therefore, it is not enough to have a Supreme Court that might rule on behalf of Jack Phillips by 5-4 on a technicality. That is not enough, right? We know that that's not enough. And you have to think about the politics in civilizational terms to actually be able to rise to confront the moment. So what that actually leads to in terms of policy, like you said, we probably don't have enough time to get into it, but just that shift on the right of how we think about politics, how we approach politics at every level, I think would be a radical departure from the way the right has thought about politics for decades. And fundamentally, the bankruptcy of the way the right has thought about politics is why we've lost over and over and over again. And I think there is a shift happening. The question is if the shift happens too late, right? We can only hope that it doesn't.
Right. I agree. So what do you think is holding us back? Is it this sort of, not to pick on my older listeners, but is it sort of this boomer, starry-eyed love of the Constitution where we just pretend like we're still living in the good old days, and the Second Amendment still, not infringed, and we have full freedom of speech in every facet of our lives, and the 10th Amendment is strong, and the states have powerful muscles that they flex all the time. I mean, what is it? Is it just this mindset that we need to shift? What do you think is holding us back truly?
Yeah, I don't think loving the Constitution is bad. I love the Constitution. I love the founders. It is like I was saying earlier. It is this sort of small ball conception of politics, where again, the left is thinking civilizationally. I mean, they're quite explicit about it. They are talking civilizationally. They're approaching policy in transformational civilizational terms, and the right is constrained. It has constrained itself into these like procedural limits of the way you do politics is you run for office, and then you get elected, and then you get enough people elected who can get into office, and maybe they can pass a law where you get a corporate tax cut, that sunsets in 5 years, right?
Okay.
Like, or you get, like a few more of your guys on the court who end up actually becoming liberal in 5 years anyways, right? Like that is not that way of thinking about politics. We have just been outgunned, like psychologically, in the most fundamental sense for, my lifetime at least, if not much longer. And there's a bunch of sort of maybe sociological explanations for that. The right, I would argue the right hasn't really been right wing, since at least like the 70s or the 80s. Neoconservatism, which is a whole other conversation, was liberal and was seeking accommodation with the regime rather than seeking to overturn it. So there's a bunch of like sociological explanations for why, but that almost doesn't matter as much as the point that that's why, right? That the right has not understood what was happening to their country. And I think when you don't understand fundamentally what's happening in your country, you can never confront it, let alone actually change it. So it is the way the right conceives of politics in a fundamental sense that has been their Achilles heel. And that's basically the root cause of all of the right's failures for decades and decades.
Yeah, 100%. Because I agree, the left is thinking big picture and the right are nearsighted. Exactly. So, Nate, where do we go from here?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I mean, like in the immediate sense, 2024 is obviously the election, of at least recent American political history. And I think everything, to an extent, not everything hinges on that, but that will define the future in important senses, not just for the country, but specifically for the right, what happens to the right. Because there are a lot of people, I mean, I live in DC. I don't work directly in GOP politics, but I work sort of around it. There's a lot of people in the GOP who not only don't get it, but who are sort of militantly committed to returning to the old GOP. I think people don't understand not how shallow the Trump revolution was, but how it has yet to sort of penetrate into the actual like machine of the GOP. And a lot of the normal people in the GOP at the RNC, in Congress, et cetera, like do not get it, and very much would just like to go back to sort of 2012, where all they wanted to do was tax cuts and start new wars. And if they can sort of get away from Trump, they'll snap back right into the old way of doing things, which would be a catastrophe for the country for all the reasons we just got into. So I think it is critical that Trump wins, first of all, but not just that. It is critical that when Trump wins, it is definitive for the right, for the GOP, for the conservative movement in a way that it completely discredits the old conservatism and makes it definitively clear that we are never going back to that kind of right, to that kind of conservatism. Because you can't, the right, as much as I have profound disagreements with or critiques of the Republican Party of the right, there is no other vehicle for people who are patriots, for people who want to do something about what's happening in their country. That's the only game in town. So the only way you can take back the country is by transforming the American political right first. And I think that hinges on this election. I think if Trump loses, you're going to see a lot of people very quickly try to maneuver to take the GOP back to where it was. And that cannot happen. That would be a catastrophe.
Right. I agree. And for those of you who are about to get in the comments and say, but the Libertarian Party is a vehicle. No. Just this last weekend, the Libertarian convention happened. For those of you who don't follow libertarian politics, because I don't expect any of you to, we had Joshua Smith and Clint Russell have both been on the show before. great guys. I think that they genuinely believe what they say, and they are much more aligned with what we call the new right, which is really just a resurgence of the old right from the 1950s. To your point earlier, Nate. But they lost. They are not the nominee. Instead, the nominee is a pro-mask, pro-vaccine, pro-transgender surgeries, open border. Essentially, he's just a Democrat that's running as a libertarian. And so the Libertarian Party, in a way, they gave a great gift to Donald Trump, because now Donald Trump is officially the most right-wing individual running on the presidential ticket. And there's no libertarian alternative that is anywhere close to being as liberty-minded as Donald Trump. But either way, it showed to me, I was excited to see all these things happening in the Libertarian Party this year. It seemed like the fact that RFK and Donald Trump both went to the Libertarian National Convention, which has never happened before, that a former sitting president visited the Libertarian Party, let alone a president from an opposite party. So it seemed like the Libertarians were really starting to make waves this year with the Mises Caucus and all the groundwork that they had laid. But ultimately, I think Dave Smith didn't run, and that's a lot of what squandered it. But at the end of the day, they picked more of a Louisiana Libertarian Party pick. The whole I'll fight for your freedom to have a tank to defend your drag queen story hour from bigots that don't want it to happen. So libertarian Lolberts are going to Lolbert. So ultimately, we are faced with, once again, the Republican Party being the best vehicle that we have, and it is in very rough shape and needs major repairs. And hopefully, we can see that through. And to your point, I think that Trump absolutely does need to win. I think his VP pick is going to be a huge factor for once. The vice presidency is viewed as a warm bucket of spit kind of office. It's kind of a do nothing office. But I think for the first time in a long time, the vice presidency is really signaling whether or not Trump has learned his lessons. If we see a Nikki Haley vice presidential pick, I don't even know if I can vote for that ticket in good conscience, because I think that's just voting for a Trump impeachment or worse. And a Nikki Haley presidency. But if we see a JD Vance or someone like that as his VP pick, I think that shows Trump signaling that he is ready to not only go in there and be serious, but he is also setting up a successor, someone who could carry on the mantle of America First movement, whether you like that name or not. And just these ideas that you and I have been talking about of actually recognizing what time it is, like the men of Issachar, and knowing what it is that we have to do. Given the fact that, to put a bow on this whole conversation, the original Constitution of the founding era is officially dead.
Totally agree. And I think I agree with everything you said. I really like Clint Russell, and I see a lot to like about the Mises Caucus. I've tweeted before, like, authentic libertarianism. I mean, some people call it sort of paleo-libertarianism. I have a lot in common with that. The problem is that capital L libertarians often run away from everything that makes real libertarianism cool, and embrace, what you're seeing at the Libertarian Party right now. So, Trump is far from perfect. He's a deeply flawed man. I think even his strongest supporters would agree with that. I don't think many people would deny that. He's also brilliant in important ways, and only someone like Donald Trump could have brought about the kind of revolutionary change to the GOP that he did in 2016. I mean, the man is amazing. He's a force of nature in ways that, like, only a few men like that come along every generation. But I think his political instincts are good, and he often got talked out of those political instincts by bad people whispering in his ear in ways that were catastrophic during the first term. And to your point, I mean, the VP pick, a lot of other things, it's important to sort of watch that and see, has he learned his lesson? And I think the way he's talking, the policies he's actually been unrolling, like, those are good signs. But you are right, like, something like the VP pick is critical to see, like, is this going to be someone who can sort of in some ways complete the promise of the Trump revolution that was inaugurated in 2015, but never really came to fruition when he was in office. And, knock on wood, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, as am I. We'll ultimately have to just wait and see. I know we're out of time here. I wanted to just throw up this question on the screen real quick here and see if you wanted to take a shot at it, Nate. It says, how do we operate as Christians that live under a constitution that no longer protects them? It verbally does, but legally doesn't.
You have to win. That is the only way to live out your conscience as a Christian. The alternative, people talk about this thing called the Benedict option. It was it was the title of a book by Rod Dreher, where he's basically arguing that conservative Christians need to sort of retreat into little enclaves, carve out their little slices of society, and go off and live according to their conscience. What the last decade should have shown is that they will not let you do that. Right? You can be Jack Phillips, mind your own business, never try to hurt anyone. You never show up to protest anyone or anything. You just want to run your bakery in peace in small town Colorado, and they will come for you, and they will root you out, and they will ruin your life. So it's uncomfortable because it is a daunting task that lies ahead of us, but the only way out is through. And the only way to win is to win. There is no other alternative. There is no other option. And I think Christians, patriots, conservatives have to come to terms with that and understand the stakes and understand the road ahead of them.
I completely agree. Well said. Well, thank you, Nate. It was a wonderful conversation. Where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing?
Everything's just on my Twitter. So at NJ Hochman, NJHochman on X, not Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Nate. Appreciate it. And thank you, listener. We really appreciate you joining us. Whatever platform you consumed us on, feel free to hit the like button, give us 5 stars, give us a great review of whatever you need to do on the platform that you are consuming this on. And feel free to go over to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. Put in your email for free to get the episodes directly to your email, as well as extra content such as writing from yours truly. And of course, there's a paid option if you want to support the show and get some additional content. Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.